This is History 425, and we're going into part 3 of this week's lecture and talking about Tibet. We'll be talking about the period between 1962 and 1982. Let's go on to slide 3. After the revolt that occurred in 1959, which we examined earlier, the Dalai Lama was an instant international celebrity, but his status in the international community and that of the exiled Tibetan government has gone up and then down and then up again over the course of the decades. And it was during this period between 1959 and 1969, this first decade of his exile, that his status started out fairly high and took a gradual decline. And it's the interesting part about this is that as his status as an international figure declined, he maintained a very prominent status. But then near the time of Deng Xiaoping's return to power, his status rose. And as we'll see a few slides hence, when it got to be 1980, the Chinese thought they had a tremendous advantage, and they did indeed have an initial tactical advantage with Deng Xiaoping's international popularity and the seeming declining relevance of the Dalai Lama and his exiled government. The Chinese were able to bring him to the negotiating table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You can see here in this first 10 years that the Tibetans maintained influence in the West, mostly because in the West there were voting publics that thought it wouldn't be such a great idea to just abandon the Tibetan people. But governments had different ideas. The United States government initially supported the Tibetans and indeed supported them in a clandestine way as well, but via pressure from Taipei, that is the Republic of China, that is Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist, who did not want to see an independent Tibet. The Americans eventually dropped the idea of urging self-determination for Tibet as a state. The UN General Assembly continued to express concern for Tibetans, and indeed that never went away. UNGA means UN General Assembly. I think you probably know the difference between the UN General Assembly and the Security Council. If you don't, please get on the web and you can figure that out probably in about 2 minutes. Anyway, as we got closer to the time of Richard Nixon and the trip to China that we discussed last time, then it became more and more a U.S. priority to get closer to China in order to cultivate it as a counterweight to the Soviet Union in the larger purposes of the Cold War, and the previous support for the Tibetans became more and more inconvenient. Let's go on to slide 4. So this is meant to be a preview of what we're about to discuss over the next 6 or 7 slides. What happened in post-rebellion Tibet itself, getting away from the international scene and the Dalai Lama and all that stuff. Basically, the state began to penetrate everyday life in a much more thorough fashion than they had done before, when they were relying upon the Tibetan government to administer the place, while they were still, that is, while the Chinese were still in a relatively weak position. You probably remember I made the analogy of the U.S. invading Iraq back in 2003. The U.S. was able to invade Iraq just like that, but Occupying and administering the country was a different matter, and the Chinese faced the same sort of problem. Their problem was not that they didn't have enough troops to do this. Their problem was that it was difficult to maintain enough troops to do this. But once they put roads in place, and then once the rebellion came along, and the Chinese government decided to depose the Tibetan government and just administer Tibet itself, the elites of Tibet became less relevant to Beijing. Previously, they needed those elites to administer the country. Now, they just weren't as important anymore, and they were kind of a pain in the rear as it was to Chinese rule. So the Chinese got rid of them. They didn't march them all off to slave camps or anything, but they simply deposed them from power and started to administer Tibet in ways that were more familiar in other parts of the PRC. And we'll get into some details as we continue. On to slide 5. One of the most important events that occurred during this time was the Sino-Indian Border War in late 1962, October-November 1962. It came about because of several intersecting sets of events. Number one, the Cuban Missile Crisis arose in October 1962, and it was very plain to Mao Zedong and probably to Zhou Enlai as well that the Americans and the Soviets were going to be quite busy during this time, that China could do almost whatever it wanted at this point, and they would have less opposition from the Americans or the Russians. At this point, the Russians were competing with China for influence in India, and of course the Americans might be inclined to do something in defense of India, and while they were at it, add to their mischief-making in Tibet. So the Cuban Missile Crisis seemed like the ideal time to do this thing that the Chinese wanted to do, and that was to enforce their claims along the disputed border with India, the McMahon line. I don't want to go back over that old ground. We covered that early in the course. Just a brief reminder, it had to do with the Simla Conference in 1903 that settled the border, or so the British thought, between China and their colony, their big colony in India. So the aftermath of this was that the Chinese looked back and thought it sure was a good idea that we occupied Tibet, because if we hadn't done it the way we did it, perhaps we would be facing incursions along our border, loss of sovereign territory. And on the other side of the border, Indian public opinion, which was very important to the Indian government since it was an elected government, Indian public opinion became even more sympathetic to Tibet and less sympathetic to China, and government policy pretty much followed the same way. The Nehru, the prime minister, pulled back from the non-aligned conference during this time, and became closer to the Americans. This was during the Kennedy administration. There was a good book written by the U.S. ambassador there at the time about all of his experiences, but let's not dwell on that. Going on to slide 6. The CIA continued its efforts to inflict lots of pinpricks on the Chinese Communist regime during the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, but it never really amounted to much. At the height, there were 150 people trained in Camp Hale, Colorado, and later on in Saipan, 150 Tibetans, over the course of a couple of years. And if you stop and think about it, that's really not very much. Of course, these were people who were meant to be dropped in and to recruit others. Still, it's not like the Americans were dropping several thousand people every year into Tibet to attack the Chinese. It was a pain for them. They had to pay extra attention to the roads between eastern Tibet, Kham, where the Khampas were from, and Lhasa. They had to pay extra attention to the road between Lhasa and Shigatse in the south, and extra attention to the road that went up to Xinjiang. So this meant stationing a lot of PLA troops that would not otherwise have been needed in those places. So it was a diversion, but it really wasn't a diversion that served any purpose other than to piss off the Chinese and make them think the Americans were out to get them. So eventually, as I mentioned, aid was wound down in 1969, and the Dalai Lama was convinced by the Nepalese to urge the closing of the Mustang camp in Nepal in 1974, and with the closing of that camp ended all violent resistance, all armed resistance of Tibetans in an organized way inside of Tibet. Going on to slide 7. During this period, there is Chinese propaganda that says that modernization was brought to Tibet, but really the only modernization that was brought to Tibet was new roads, some electricity for the army, things like that. But living standards were not improved, and indeed, during this time, Mao Zedong became convinced that it was time to extend, as we discussed 2 weeks ago, it was time to extend socialization, that is, the advancement of socialist values and principles into agriculture and industry throughout the country. And now that this revolt was taken care of, and so on, there was no reason to exempt Tibet anymore. And so land reform was the first step. The land reform itself was popular because it meant to the peasants who were affected that they received land, that they were no longer on these manorial estates. They were given parcels of land to farm themselves, and this is now is in the valleys where barley is grown in Tibet. I hope that if any of you are inclined to travel to China, I hope you make it to Tibet, because I don't think you can understand China's position unless you see, at least from the air, this enormous, impressive, beautiful, stark landscape that makes up that place. The mountains are barren and rock-strewn, and there are valleys. And in the valleys, you have in the wintertime the nomads with their yaks. In the wintertime, in the summertime, the nomads go up into the mountains with the yaks. And if you ever take a trek across Tibet, it's sort of like walking along the banks of the Willamette River, where there's lots of goose poop. Yak poop is everywhere. It's impressive and amazing. And the yak poop is used as the major fuel for the nomadic peoples to heat their tents. But anyway, I wander afield here through the fields of yak stuff. Communes were also introduced in a second wave of reform during this time, and here I'm talking about now, beginning in 1966. Tibet's a big place. It took 3 years to start it up. But in the course of the Cultural Revolution, communes were introduced. They were not popular because they meant that people were no longer being paid directly for producing anything, but they still had to come up with taxes. in the Shakya book. There's a I don't recall the exact words, but he quotes a saying in Tibet that change comes to Tibet like the waves come to a faraway place, something like that. And what they're trying to say by that is that if something happens in China, it eventually happens in Tibet, but it happens later. And this is a principle that maybe it's less true today, but it was certainly true back in those times. These changes that happened in China tended to take between 6 months and a year and a half or 2 years longer to occur in Tibet itself. It seems, as I go through these readings and as I look at other material, it seems to me that the famine that existed throughout China did not really affect Tibet in the same way. And I think there are two reasons for this. One is that the policies of the Great Leap did not affect Tibet nearly as quickly as they did in China. By the time they could have reached Tibet, the Great Leap had become a disaster already. And the second reason is that the nature of the agricultural economy in Tibet is much different than it is in China. In China, it was already socialized, and so the steps that were being taken, the whole backyard steel producing effort and planting fields in an unusual way in order to get extremely high yields that ended up backfiring and producing nothing. Those things did not happen in Tibet because they simply did not have the same kind of crops or the same kind of supervision, and nomadic farming, in essence, of raising yaks, is a major part of the agricultural economy. By the way, Tibetans are not vegetarians. Tibetans are Buddhist, and they believe in protecting human life. And if you've seen that kind of silly movie 7 Years in Tibet, you see people trying to save the lives of worms and stuff like that. People really do stuff like that, but the point is that they have to live too. Killing a yak, a great big yak that produces a bunch of meat, killing one yak is considered the same as killing one worm, and since you get so much meat from killing one yak, we can make an exception. I'm being very, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but I'm not really misrepresenting things. Going on to slide 8. So the preparation to change the relationship between Tibet and China, that is, to move it away from being some accepted and unusual region of the People's Republic, the preparation to change that and move Tibet into being a part of China occurred in the 3 years before the establishment of the Tibetan Autonomous Region in 1965, so from 62 to 65. I've got the bullet points up there under initial preparation. These are things I've pretty much already talked about, or that you can imagine, closure of monasteries and such. People started to refer to China as the interior. And of course, if it's the interior, that means it's the same country. People started to refer to Tibetans as Tibetans, as they did before, but they didn't refer to Chinese as Chinese. They would say the Han people and the Tibetan people, and we're all Chinese. I've been to Tibet several times, and each time I go, I have fun with this. I'll be talking to a Chinese person. I'll refer to the Tibetans and the Chinese. They'll immediately stop me and say, no, no, no. We're all Chinese. You mean the Han people and the Tibetan people? Yes, you're right. I suppose you're right. And so more preparations besides these cultural and linguistic ones were taken. Of course, these 3 big education Three Big Educations was substituted for the socialist education movement, the one that Mao took control of, or initiated rather, in order to bring China back away from bourgeois and capitalist rotor policies of Liu Shaoqi before the Cultural Revolution, which we discussed last week. These three big educations had to do with getting rid of traditional beliefs, attacking organized religion that had dominated society, attacking the traditional relationship between the urban and rural elites and ordinary people, attacking the extreme respect given to the Dalai Lama, and the beginning of attacks on the respect given to the Panchen Lama, his rival, who was based in Shigatse in the south and who had become a loyal supporter of the regime. The regime, certainly a decision made by Mao as he moved toward implementing the Cultural Revolution. He decided that the Panchen Lama was going to have to go, along with the rest of the Tibetan elite that did not become absolutely loyal to the Communist Party. So those were the sorts of moves that were pursued under these three big educations in order to prepare the country for more thorough integration and being renamed as an autonomous region. And what's the difference in all this? The difference is that instead of having a semi-independent government and an exceptional area that you don't mess around with so much as you do with the rest of China, you end up with a TAR, a Tibetan Autonomous Region, that has in charge of it people who hold the same kind of positions they would anywhere else in the PRC. You have a regional party committee, you have a regional people's congress, and you rule the place as if it were just another province of the PRC. We'll stop this audio here and continue on slide 9 of part 3.